Welcome back to Everything We Know. Once again, we're diving into another poll. This time, it's the Harvard Harris poll that was released this week after the Roe v. Wade decision, that Dobbs v. Mississippi that we talked about in a previous video and on our podcast. Make sure to check the link down there in the description for that. But before we look at this poll, we want to look and see that this is a B plus pollster according to 538. Called 83% of races correctly out of 182 analyzed. This is a um, very prolific poll here. However, there are some big margin differences, including calling Florida for Biden by 3 points. That's off by 6.4, as well as Peters to win the Senate election um, by 7, only won by 1.7. That's 5.3 points off. And then nationally, the House, they were off by 1.9. So there is generally a Democratic lean to this poll. Of course, you can find outliers. They did think that Gilliam was going to win by 4.7 points when ultimately DeSantis won that. It's a 5.1 point shift as well. They've called different races for the Republicans that should have gone Democratic, but in general, it's a Democratic leaning poll organization in terms of oversampling some Democrats. Now, why does that matter? It matters because when we dig into the poll data, we should take it with a grain of salt and assume that anywhere from a 1.9 to a 5.1 point difference can be applied here, especially when it comes to some of the head-to-head matchups that they polled on. And this is one of the first polls that I've seen that has looked into the likely matchup between Biden and Trump, or um, Biden and Harris, or even DeSantis and Harris. Gonna get in here some pretty interesting stuff. All right, page 4. Perceptions of the direction of the country. Roughly 70% of the country says that we're on the wrong track, 24% on the right track. Those wrong track numbers have pretty consistently outpaced the right track numbers, except for the beginning of the Biden presidency, and it's been downhill from there. Pretty similar here on the US economy. Most people did believe that the US economy was going on the right track, at least more so than the wrong track, during most of the Trump presidency until you hit 2020. And then you see Trump losing on his big issue of the economy. Now, what we see since July of last year is more and more of the country progressively feeling like the economy is getting worse. And that's the trajectory right now. Again, 71-21. Perceived strength of the US economy, very similar, 72% to 28%. Whereas people previously may have thought that the economy was on the wrong track. They also thought that it was strong in general, which is this blue here. Now there is a general perception since about this time last year that the economy is not strong, and definitely since March of 2020 when the pandemic hit and the U.S. economy really took a hit. But about this time last year, people were generally feeling like we were on the way to recovery, and since then, it's been a downhill slide. How that's going to impact the elections and politics in general is people are feeling like this economy is not working for them. Their government is not working for them. And so that's going to have tremendous political repercussions and electoral repercussions as people go to vote in November. They're going to be voting for the party that is not in power. They're going to be voting for the party that is really the one pointing the fingers at the people in power who have quote unquote led to this or shepherded in this period in our economy. Now you can see that contrary to what's been coming out of the White House recently, most Americans, in fact, now 64% of Americans in an increasing trend, are saying that their financial situation is getting worse. The number of people who say that it's getting better and it's improving has tanked down to 16%. And those who say it's just as well off is also following a similar downward trend toward just 20% right now. So the vast majority of the country, roughly 2/3, are saying that their financial situation is getting worse. And that's going to have huge political repercussions when we get to November. Because if this trend continues, then people are going to vote on those pocketbook issues. They're going to care about how it impacts their ability to pay bills, to put food on the table, their ability to get to a job, or their ability to see their family, go on vacation, etc. Um, Now, voters in general are pessimistic. 43% are pessimistic about life over the next year. Only a third are optimistic. I don't think this is an incredibly important question, other than to say that people don't expect life to get better. They're not expecting, in general, that the current administration is going to turn things around. But what they are expecting is that this previous trend that we see here is going to continue. And if it does, and they're proven right so far come November, um, we pretty much know how the vast majority is going to vote, especially when you consider the approval ratings here. He started out with pretty high approval ratings about this time last year. And as faith in the economy has dipped, so has his approval rating, now down to 38% in this pollster that usually leans more Democratic and oversamples Democrats. Um, so to have 57% disapproval rating combined versus a 38% combined approval rating, it's pretty dismal for Biden right now. Um, this big headline here is management on the issues is weak across the board. Look at it. The only thing that he is near positive on is that 50% approval rating in the way that he's reacted to coronavirus. Things like the economy down at 32% approval, handling inflation 28% approval, stimulating jobs 43%. Even things like immigration, which plays big down in Texas and Arizona, that's 37%. Um, Overall, administering the government 38%. There's not a lot of faith in the White House right now. And GOP approval hasn't necessarily gotten too much better as of late, especially with recent firearms legislation, where the GOP tends to still push firearms and Second Amendment rights. Hasn't really been playing out very well for them because of quite a few mass shootings so far that have been hitting the media recently. And so we can see disapproval of Democrats and disapproval of Republicans. Um, However, when you look at the Democratic Party compared to the Republican Party, you can see right here that there's a much more meaningful split. Only 40% approval compared to 45, and 60% disapproval compared to 55% disapproval. So you've got a 10-point spread for Republicans and a 20-point spread for Democrats. Congressional approval is also on its way down as people are feeling like the economy's not working for them, the government's not working for them, down at 28%. Again, massive political repercussions. This is one of the things that ushered in the Trump era of America's not working for every American. So we're going to see that rhetoric pop up again in 2024, especially if this continues. Now, interestingly, Trump, Pence, and Bernie Sanders are the three most favorable political figures that they polled on. So Donald Trump with a net favorability rating of minus 12%, but a positive favorability rating of 42%. So more people view him positively than anyone else that they polled on. Mike Pence, 39 to 40. Actually pretty good for him, with only a minus 1% disapproval. Bernie Sanders, they made a typo here that should say 2%. And then this should say 8%. So I'm not sure where they got some of those numbers for. But Ron DeSantis is the only one other than Tim Scott, Senator Tim Scott, out of South Carolina, that has a positive approval rating. And that means that he's probably going to be viewed on very favorably, especially as he picks up some of that Trump rhetoric that we saw back in 2016, where the country is just not working for all people. The economy's not working for all people. And of course, you pin it on the current Congress and the current president, and that tends to play pretty well politically. Um, the military also has a huge uh, net favorability rating here, 67% positive over everything else. Interestingly, though, Amazon is at number two, 73 to 17, which gives you a 56% net favorability rating. Supreme Court, even after the Dobbs v. Jackson decision, has a positive favorability rating at 8%, and the Justice Department has 14%. Now, Twitter, China, Antifa, Russia are all pretty negative down here, going as far down as negative 63% for Russia. No one expects them to be no one expects them to be positive. All right. The notable shifts in voters' priorities. Basically, coronavirus is not really cared about very much anymore as we're kind of dealing with the tail end of the pandemic here. Guns has jumped up significantly. Women's rights has jumped up significantly. School safety jumped up significantly. Um, However, price increases and inflation and the economy and jobs remain the top two priorities. Republicans are winning on those issues. Republicans are not winning on gun rights issues. They're not winning nationwide on women's rights issues either. Um, so long as they keep the rhetoric on price increases, inflation, economy, and jobs, then they will do very well come November and perhaps also in another 2 years. The number one overall priority is inflation. Biggest concern combined with second biggest concern is 62% of people said one of those two things. Energy prices right after that, and then abortion rights behind that. When you ask what people's biggest concern is, when you ask for top two, guns does not make the list unless you want to consider crime down here. All right, midterms. We're going to dive right in here. I know it's already been a long video, but there's a lot in this poll that is very important. According to this pollster, it's a deadlock 50-50 on how people are going to be voting in the general election. Now, there are basically the independents barely favor Republicans. And again, I would take this with a grain of salt and probably add 4 points over to the Republican side based on the track history of this poll. A lot of people do have expressed doubts about Biden's mental fitness. 60%, including 27% of Democrats, say that they have doubts about his fitness to be president. And 34% of Democrats say that he's too old to be president. 73% of independents say that he's too old to be president. 67% of independents, so full 2/3 of independents, say that he might be mentally unfit to be president. So he's not going to be very popular come the midterms or come 2024 if he decides to run again. Donald Trump is a clear favorite over Ron DeSantis and then Mike Pence for Republican presidential primary. If Trump doesn't run, DeSantis gets a huge bump up there. He's up 20 points. Pence up 10. Cruz up an additional 7. So I would anticipate it being one of those three as a front runner if Donald Trump doesn't run, just based on current data right now. Ron DeSantis, Mike Pence, Ted Cruz are going to be up there. And then if the Democratic presidential primary were held today, most people would still vote for Joe Biden, or the plurality would vote for Joe Biden, then Harris, then Sanders. Pete Buttigieg is also a dark horse there to make a big splash. AOC also on this list. If Biden doesn't run, you're going to get Harris, Clinton, Sanders, Buttigieg over there as your top candidates. And then in a hypothetical matchup, and this is very important, very key here, Donald Trump has a 3-point margin over Joe Biden with 17% undecided. Pretty similar numbers over there if it's Trump v. Harris, except for you have more breakaway voters over into the Donald Trump column, where he's up by 6 points over Kamala Harris. And then in a hypothetical matchup between Ron DeSantis and Kamala Harris is actually up by 2 points with a larger contingent of undecideds. And what that tells me is that um, DeSantis is just not as well known because you don't have significant break for Kamala Harris um, over Biden. In fact, you have slightly less support for Kamala Harris. And it doesn't change depending on whether it's Donald Trump or whether it's Ron DeSantis. You just have more undecideds. And so most of those undecideds are probably going to go over um, to the Republican Party. Most people, 71%, say that he should not run for a second term. 45% of those say it's because he's a bad president. 20 or 30% say that it's because he's too old. And 61% of people surveyed say that Donald Trump should not run again in 2024. And it's pretty even split between he's erratic, he will divide America, and he's responsible for January 6th that people cite as their reasons. And then 60% of candidates would consider a moderate candidate over either of them if that moderate candidate was running independently. And this is not vote for, this is consider. And it's pretty even across the board by age and by gender as well. Now, January 6th Commission. Over half of U.S. voters are following the January 6th hearings, either very closely or somewhat closely. And the majority of voters say the hearings are biased or partisan, including 17% of Democrats, 84% of Republicans, and 58% of independents say that these hearings are biased. 30% of Democrats say that it's more of a partisan exercise. 78% or 79% rather of Republicans say the same. It's interesting that there's a contingent of Republicans who say that it is biased but working as an independent inquiry. So that's an interesting quirk of this poll. And most voters, almost 2/3, say that Congress should be focusing on other things rather than January 6th. They blame protesters, Donald Trump, and both equally as responsible for the Capitol riots. The majority of the voters say the Capitol riots were protests that turned violent. That's 56 to 44, saying that the intent was a protest that became violent rather than an armed insurrection as the intent. However, most people, 61%, say that there was at least some pre-planning by right-wing groups such as the Proud Boys, instead of it being just a spontaneous protest. Voters in general are split on whether Trump had an impact on instigating the riots. 51-49, again, very much along partisan lines, with 21% of Democrats saying that it was spontaneous protests that turned violent, and 22% of Republicans saying that Trump deliberately encouraged these. What that means is this is going to be a very polarizing issue, but people in general say that the hearings are dividing the country. It's being used as an excuse to silence voices on the right, including nearly half of Democrats who believe that it's just meant to silence voices on the right. So even a lot of Democrats who agree with what's happening there do believe that the way that it is being played out is in a very hyper-partisan manner, and is not being very beneficial. I mean, even 43% of Democrats say that it's further dividing the country, 88% of Republicans, and 72% of independents. So the whole January 6th committee, all of those hearings, yes, people are watching, but really what it comes down to is people don't care what the outcome is. They've already have their preconceived notions of what the outcome should be and believe that what's going on right now is just political theater that is dividing the country. And so the Democrats, even if they get what they want from this committee is they're going to lose in the end, because independents are seeing this as just theater that is wasting time and resources. Um, and so they're not going to score the political points that they think that they will with this committee. Yeah, in general, um, people do think that these are bad publicity for Trump. It's not that they think that is going to matter a whole lot. Now, we move into another big section, and that's the Roe v. Wade or the Dobbs v. Mississippi, Dobbs v. Jackson case. Over half of voters oppose the ruling, and people have been really paying attention to this, either very closely or somewhat closely. 55% oppose the decision, 45% support the decision to send abortion laws back down to the states. And even 31% of Democrats support this. So that's a huge number. We talked a little bit ago on the podcast with Jess Meath, who's the National Communications Director for Democrats for Life, and she talked about the 30 million Democrats, 20 or 30 million Democrats who are pro-life. And I think that's really represented here in this poll, even though Democrats tend to be oversampled once again in this particular poll, is that roughly a third of Democrats polled really agree with this decision. And more than a third of Republicans oppose this decision. Independents are split 60-40. The vast majority of voters in this country have shown that they support abortion in at least some cases. And we talked about that on the podcast. Again, link is in the description if you want a really good podcast episode to listen to and hear some good conversations on the issue. The majority of voters do expect some sort of rollback at the state level. But what's interesting about these two things here, the one on the left, do you think your state should allow abortion at up to 9 months, 23 weeks, 15, 6, and then only cases of rape and incest? That's on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, do you think your state will allow abortion at 9 months, 23 weeks, 15 weeks, etc.? And what's really, really interesting here is that these line up very, very well. 10%, 10%, 18 to 17, 23 to 20, 12 to 16 is really in those early areas that there's a little discrepancy. But even in the only cases of rape and incest, it's exactly the same on both sides. People in America are generally believe that what they think should happen will happen. And I think that's why we see, 45% of people supporting this decision, and like even a third of Democrats supporting the decision and 40% of independents supporting the decision, is that in general they think that what should happen in their state is what will happen in their state. 7 in 10 voters believe the Supreme Court has created turmoil when it comes to this. That's 69%. Most people, there's a big split here, a three-way split on whether abortion standards should be set by judges of the Supreme Court. That's actually only 25%. And which goes to show that the decision made by the court to send it down to the states is actually supported. And that's, 44% of individuals believe that the state legislatures should make this decision, which bodes pretty well with the 45% of people who supported that decision. And then Democrats in particular have been arguing recently that it should go to a congressional vote. And so I believe that's why we get the 25 plus the 31 on one side versus 44% who agree with the decision to send it down to the states over there at 44%. Over a third of voters deem the SCOTUS to be legitimate. My bad there. When you look at the Supreme Court of the United States, is it legitimate or illegitimate? 2/3 of the country believe that it's illegitimate, or that it is, legitimate. Not sure why I'm not able to talk today. But it's roughly cut in half between legitimate and illegitimate for Democrats. The GOP, which pretty much got what they wanted this last term of the court, it breaks 3-1. Independents break basically 60-40 on that issue. Um, and the vast majority of people, roughly 60-40 again, believe that it is wrong for Democrats to call the Supreme Court illegitimate, including a full third of Democrats think that it's wrong for Democrats to call it illegitimate, and that sets a very bad precedent. Now, overall, there's not really any effect on the midterm voting, according to this poll. 36% are more likely to vote for Democrat, 36% are more likely to vote for Republican as a result, and 29% say there's no effect. So everything basically cancels itself out here. It's going to be about the economy come this fall. It's going to be about the economy. In general, it's going to be about the economy here. We could dive more into abortion. We can dive more into guns here, but we'll wrap things up with guns real quick. Basically, there was a gun control bill that was recently passed by the Senate. Most people believe that there will be at least some impact, whether it's a large impact or a small impact, on gun violence by creating harsher penalties for straw purchases and gun trafficking, enhancing background checks, closing the boyfriend loophole that prevents convicted domestic abusers from purchasing a firearm for a period of 5 years, whether or not you are married to that person. The allocation of billions of dollars for mental health services also sees pretty significant support in its belief to have a large impact. And then the provision that is projected to have the least amount of impact would be clarifying the definition of a federally licensed firearms dealer. Last question on here. Half of voters say that neither side is winning in the war on Ukraine. More people do believe that Russia is winning than Ukraine is winning, which might feed into some recent thoughts about the U.S. spending on Ukraine in the war over there. So there you have it. The latest poll out of Harvard Harris. Again, take everything in this poll with a little bit of grain of salt and consider it an extra 2 to 5 points in favor of Republicans across the board based on previous polling history from this organization. Otherwise, it's been a very long video so far, but a lot of really good information that indicates that Republicans are likely to win come November, and that DeSantis actually has a really good shot in 2024 if it's DeSantis Harris. So if you like this video, go ahead and hit the like button down below, subscribe so that you can see more breakdowns of polls just like this. We usually do shorter videos. We do have a podcast, so make sure to check that out. Like I said, links are going to be down there in the description, as well as links to every single one of the articles that we looked at here today. So you can look through them for yourself. Thanks so much for joining. Once again, my name is Matthew Lucci, and this has been Everything We Know.